Yes, hello everybody. I was here 2 years ago, and it is a great pleasure to be here in Mons again. At that time, the book I was writing was not yet finished, but now it has been out for 1 year, and this is it. And it's the first volume of 3 in which I'm trying to write the history of the Beatles as thoroughly and as accurately as I can.
So, you are the historian, I mean the official historian for the Beatles.
No, actually
on.
not official, no.
But I mean for us, I mean...
Okay, but there is no official historian, but I have worked for the Beatles for many years, but right now I'm not working for them. This book is independent.
Right, so could we start with what you aimed to do at the very beginning? Because I think your work is tremendous. I mean, we've already talked with friends of ours, and you had emails and so on, and everybody is really thrilled about what you've done. And I think it's a work of your lifetime, I mean, yeah. Because it's the life of the Beatles, the life of ourselves.
Well, I started writing about the Beatles when I was young, so much younger than today, and
you didn't need any help. Yeah.
And my early books were reference books, so I did the book of the Beatles Recording Sessions, for example, and the Complete Beatles Chronicle, and books that you could look something up. But and at that time, people in book publishing said to me, would I write a biography of the Beatles? And there was Hunter Davis and a few other writers like that. And I didn't feel that I could do it. I was not mature enough, I didn't have enough experience, and I didn't think I could do that as a writer. But as I got older, I realized actually, yes, I can do it. And I just do the same research, very, very deep research, very concerned about accuracy and about real understanding. But instead of writing it as a reference book, write it as a real narrative, a proper work of history. And it's a chance to get the Beatles story right, and do it really, really thoroughly, while people who were part of it are still alive.
You've done a wonderful job. I mean, it's not finished because we've got volume 1, volume 2 and volume 3, but your first volume is amazing. I mean, because it starts from very early in the 18th century?
About 1855 or thereabouts, 1850. It's because my first question as a writer is, why Liverpool? Why Liverpool? Why does this story take place in Liverpool and not in London or in Paris or anywhere else? And so I did the genealogical research into all the Beatles, and I discovered that the Lennon family arrived in Liverpool from Ireland because of the potato famine, the crisis, the great hunger and disease period in Ireland in the middle of the 19th century. So I tell that story, and then I tell the stories of all the families. And the parents of the Beatles are very interesting, just like the Beatles are. They also had very interesting lives, and I enjoyed researching and telling all of that. Like Paul McCartney's father played in a band. He had his own group, like Paul. Paul was in the Beatles, and Paul's dad was in Jim Mack's band. And I wanted to find out more about them. So everything is there if you're willing to research. I have the advantage of being able to take a long time over these books. So because of that, I can look deeper than anybody else. And my passion is for research. So the consequence is I find things that haven't been found by other people just because I look harder and I have more time to do it.
So you're a real professional, I mean, as far as all the researches are concerned. I mean, for history, for geography. Even we learn a lot about
Yes.
your book.
Yeah, I really wanted to tell the story of the Beatles as a contextual history. So they're not just a pop group. It's just like, well, what is a pop group? What is rock and roll music? Where does rock and roll come from? And how was it received by people? Because it was dangerous music in the 1950s. And if you were a fan of it, then you were aligning yourself with music which was music of delinquents. And it was very hard for young people to pursue their dreams in the immediate period after the war, when parents were saying, get a real job. And the Beatles, and not only the Beatles, but other young people as well, said, actually, we really want to play guitar. And we want to do it for as long as we can. So I have to tell the story of life in order to show how the Beatles fitted into life, and then also how they begin to change our lives. So it becomes the story, or it is the story of, well, particularly it's the story of life in Europe after the war, and in particular in England, but in Europe generally, and music from America, and how these young people were so determined in their head that they were going to do this, that they resisted their parents and managed to make it to the top.
Right?
Yeah, it's above all else, it's the story of 4 young people, or more than 4, because it tells a story of other people as well, but John, Paul, George and Ringo. And it tells them as people, not as legends, not as great stars, just as young people who have a determination and talent and humor and single-mindedness. And they're tough people. They know how to take care of themselves. They can be pretty rough with people. But I just want to tell the Beatles story completely and truthfully and leave nothing out that needs to be there. I'm not interested in writing complete trivia, but I just want to tell the story. I want to learn everything there is to know in order to make these people as understandable for all of us as possible. Yeah, it's about keeping an open mind, and it's about being neutral and not having any favorites or anybody that I dislike. So even when I tell the story of how they fired Pete Best from the Beatles, for example, it's not my opinion that counts because I wasn't there. I need to report what happened then to the people who were part of it and why they made the decision, nothing to do with what I think. And so finally now we know why they got rid of Pete Best, but also that's just a small detail. We know, I feel that my idea or my wish and desire is that at the end of people reading this book, they will understand the Beatles as people and as musicians more than they have done until this point. That's really what it's about, is telling the history as truthfully as possible, so that they can be, I think the story is a magnificent story. It's the best story of all time in all rock and roll, but in life, I think it's just a beautiful story, and it's funny and it's tragic and it's very warm and it's full of interesting people doing interesting things, and I just want to tell that story.
When you were saying that you are neutral, that you are so close, I mean, or you've been so close to Paul McCartney or maybe George or Richie, I don't know, but how can you be? Could you be neutral? You know, that's a question of mine. I mean,
I just am neutral. It's just something I am. It's I have my personal favorites. I have things I like and don't like. And when I worked for the Beatles more closely than today, I had mostly very good times and some not so good times. But that's all. That doesn't matter. As a historian, it's quite easy to tread a neutral path because it's important for the book. There is another book on the Beatles, a biography that came out about 30 years ago, and the author very clearly did not like Paul McCartney. And he attacked Paul McCartney every page, all the way through the book, for no real reason other than that it was his problem. The author had a problem, and he made us as the reader completely aware of his problem. I'm not going to do that. That's stupid, because that's not, if you're writing a history book, it doesn't matter what I think or what any author thinks. The only thing is you can shape the text, but you have to be very careful. It's a responsibility to tell this story straight. So as I said, when it comes to things in the Beatles that aren't so nice, they did happen, and I'm not going to make strong light of them, but I'm not going to avoid mentioning them either, because they are part of the truth, and it's just something that as the historian, that's what I must do.
Okay, so could we go into your book, if I may say so?
Yeah,
because I mean, it's so huge. I mean, we could spend hours with you. I mean, I would be, and I think everybody would be fine. But I would like to talk about a few topics, if you don't mind, about the managers. It's really funny. I mean, to read that there are different managers, official ones and unofficial ones. So could you tell us about, I think about the first one in 1958, Derek Hodkin, was it?
No.
In 50...
The Quarrymen had a manager.
Yes, the Quarrymen, yeah.
Brian Epstein was the Beatles manager who was the manager in the years when they were famous and did so much great work with them. But he was not the first manager. In fact, there were quite a few more than I had ever known before. Despite all the books that we have on the Beatles, people always say, well, what else can we possibly know? But in fact, there are things to learn all the time. And I discovered the existence of several managers that they had that I never knew about before. When they were the skiffle group, the Quarrymen, one of John's friends was their manager. Paul McCartney didn't like him getting a commission on the money, but so he didn't last very long. But then there was a whole period of time when John, Paul, and George played as a trio called the J Page 3.
J Page 3, yeah.
Which I'd never heard of before,
No.
J Page 3. And they had a manager who tried to get them bookings, and he recorded them onto tape. And so Derek Hodkin, this man managed the J Page 3. He lived in Paris. About 5 years ago, I went to interview him in Paris. So that was really interesting. And I even found a case for a short period of time when the Beatles were managed by two girls who were determined to make the Beatles as famous as possible, and they said, we will become your managers. And nothing really happened, but all the same, there were these two girls who managed them. I didn't know about that until I tracked one of them down, thinking she had something to tell me, and she told me something more than I was expecting. And that happened a lot with this book, of talking to people who told me amazing things. I'll just quickly add for you to translate. When you write a book like this, you have to be very careful of what people tell you, because people claim all sorts of things to do with the Beatles which are not true. And you cannot simply accept everything people say. You have to question it, you have to challenge it, and if it's not certain, don't use it, because it might not be right. So I don't just use anything, I have to apply tests to it.
And what about Nigel Worley? Because Nigel Worley was one of them, was manager too.
Yeah.
And Alan Williams, which is most known, the most.
Nigel Worley was a friend of John's, one of John's gang. Before the Beatles, John had a gang of friends, and they were John, Pete, Nige, and Ivan. So it's a bit like John, Paul, George, and Ringo, but they were just young kids who would go around making trouble, stealing things from shops and terrorizing women at bus stops and things like that. John, Pete, Nigel, and Ivan, and Nigel Wally. Nige was manager of the Quarrymen, and Alan Williams was, well, a really big part of the story. Alan Williams is now 84 years old. I saw him in Liverpool the other week. He's quite old now. But without Alan Williams, we would not be here talking about the Beatles, because he transformed he enabled them to transform themselves. The Beatles always had the talent. Managers managed, but the Beatles always had the talent. Brian Epstein did not make the Beatles talented, but what he did do was allow their talent the opportunity to be heard and seen. And Alan Williams did the same thing in a different way. In 1960, he took the Beatles to Hamburg. And without Alan Williams taking the Beatles to Hamburg, there wouldn't have been a Beatles. It was the making of them. So, yeah, Alan Williams was a very important manager, but the Beatles were quite rough with him. They got rid of him quite quickly. They used to laugh at him, and basically he sued them over the way they ended him.
So I was surprised about Alan Williams, because for me he was not a serious guy. I mean, I couldn't trust him, you know. But
yeah,
he
wrote a book about the Beatles that I loved when it came out.
Right.
The Man Who Gave the Beatles Away, 1975. I was a teenager when I read it, and it made a big impression. but for this book, I needed to find out which bits of that which bits of that book are true, and which bits are exaggerated or not true. And I sat down with him, and we pulled the book apart, and he admitted which bits were made up, and I challenged him on many of it. Also with this book, and all the books I'm writing, and always have written, documents are an absolute key part of any work of history. You have to look at pieces of paper. You can't just rely on people's memories. You have to see papers. You have to see letters and contracts and photographs and recordings. And with the Beatles, there is a rich paper trail, a very, very rich paper trail. And my job is to find as many pieces of paper as possible and to learn from them and to understand what they're trying to tell me and work out how to use that information so that it becomes clear. And so with Alan Williams, I had all of his documents as well, which he never really used when he did his book. And we went through the documents, and we got a much better story than the one that was made up.
But he had a ghostwriter too. I mean, he was not the only. Well, your book is just like a web, I would say, not an internet web, but I would say a cobweb. Yeah. And you are just like a spider. You are Mr. Spider-Man in a way. Well, yes, I was saying that there are so many things in your books, I mean, which are just a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we were listing a lot of coincidences. If you can just give me some, I've got them here because I thought it was interesting to read them. Oui, je disais, de par cette histoire de toile d'araignée, je disais qu'il y avait énormément de coïncidences dans son livre qu'il a mis en valeur, que peut-être on n'aurait jamais vu s'il n'avait fait toutes ces recherches. And there are a few of them which are really, really interesting.
Well, there are many. The story of how the Beatles got their recording contract with George Martin is full of unlikely moments that all come together to serve mankind, really, because if without these coincidences, George Martin would not have recorded the Beatles. We wouldn't have had the Beatles on record. Nobody else would give them a contract, and even he didn't want to give them one. The stories all the way through the book of things happening in the same place, like John Lennon not realizing it, but going to parties in the same place where his mother used to live. He knew very little about his background, John. So there's a lot of things I found out that he would have been very pleased to know, and sadly died without ever hearing about them.
Yes, and Paul in London at the visiting even home.
Yeah, there's a story in the book which I know is true of Paul McCartney going to London in October 1962 on his own without the other Beatles for 2 days with a girlfriend called Celia. And they went down to London to meet a man called Ivan Vaughan, who was the man who had the boy who had introduced John to Paul. He was Paul's friend and he was John's friend, and he introduced them. And Ivan was now in London, and Paul went to London to see him and needed a place to stay for the night, just to crash on the floor somewhere, and stayed in Ivan's flat, which was somewhere in a place in London called Great Portland Street, in the middle of London. And I said to Celia, recognizing that Great Portland Street was already in my book, because George Martin used to go for oboe lessons from Jane Asher's mother. This was in the 1940s. George Martin and Jane Asher's family knew each other already. And so that was in Great Portland Street. And I said, where in Great Portland Street did you stay? And she couldn't remember, of course. So I did some research, and I did some more research, and eventually, one more try, I found the address that Ivan Vaughan was living, where Paul McCartney crashed on the floor with his girlfriend, and it was in the same place. The same place as where the Ashers had lived and George Martin had been 15 years before. And it doesn't add anything to the story, except it's wow.
Yes.
There's lots of those in the book. It's just like, what are the chances of that? And in the Beatles story, these things that are so unlikely, they happen all the time.